To this point, we've introduced the poem beginning in chapter 6, verse 1. We have explored the macrostructures and microstructures. Two things yet remain. We'll close as usual by extrapolating lessons that arise from this poem. Before doing so, however, it will be important to offer some comments on short portions or individual words or verses that help to clarify the meaning. Begin by considering verses 1 and 2 of chapter 6. Here we find the grandfather's concern over the financial contract that the youth has entered into. We want to be aware that at issue here is not whether or not to be generous. Elsewhere, the sage will urge generosity toward the poor. A primary example of this appears in chapter 14, verse 21. Rather, at issue here is whether the youth has engaged in a sound business deal. The high pitch of concern evident in the grandfather's introduction, verses 1 and 2, and the short-range solutions that follow in verses 3, 4, and 5. These make sense only if disaster is imminent for the youth. They do not make sense if disaster is just one of several possible outcomes. In order for a loan guarantee to bring imminent financial disaster, two factors must be present. First, the sum guaranteed must be very large, in fact, dangerously large. Second, the likelihood of default on the part of the borrower must be quite certain. In this case, the borrower is the foreigner. It is not the youth. He is the guarantor. Ben Sira considered any such financial guarantee a substantial risk. He writes, "A guarantor's kindness do not forget, for he gave his soul on your behalf." That's Ben Sira 29:15. In this situation, it's as though the grandfather has seen this scam bilk some unsuspecting victim on an earlier occasion. Perhaps he has seen the very same foreign operator destroy another countryman by setting a large loan and then promptly clearing out with the cash, or more likely commodities, never to be seen again. Never to be seen again, that is, until today, and the grandfather noticed that this scamming foreigner has shown up in the neighborhood. So understandably, the grandfather is desperate to prevent that ruin from overtaking someone he loves. He's desperate enough to issue what winds up being the single most forceful reprimand within the grandfather's cycles of lectures, that is Proverbs 4 through 9. And now consider the terms neighbor and foreigner that we encounter in those early verses. These invite a question. Do these terms refer to separate persons? A neighbor is one individual and the foreigner is someone else in this drama? Or do they refer to one and the same? That these two represent a single individual becomes evident, I believe, when we come to verse 3 and the expression neighbor alone recurs. Incidentally, Waltke is also of this opinion. Fox, among others, differs, feeling that these individuals are different. These terms refer to different individuals. This reminds me of Robert Alter's very important observation that in studying Hebrew poetry, where we have parallelism between the first hemistich and the second, we do well to examine them in case the second may represent not just a bland recycling, but rather an intensification. Try that out on this pair, a neighbor and a foreigner. That would suggest that as the sage introduces the neighbor first, he is saying, and what's more, that same person that you thought was merely a neighbor was actually a foreigner. And there come the concerns that he has embedded in this lecturing and training from previous poems. With typically sparing words, the sage alerts us, and hopefully alerts his son, of a characteristic but crucial sort of youthful naivete. That is, the inability to assess someone else's character, whom the youth supposed was a neighbor, a disarmingly congenial friend, for who knows, perhaps their houses and interests were adjacent. That individual was in actuality one whose origins, and more importantly, one whose allegiances were far from adjacent to those of the youth. Perhaps an opportunity for profit clouded the youth's assessment. He supposed that his risk exposure would remain acceptably low. But as observed in poem number 4, such a non-countryman would have no qualms about bringing misfortune to his so-called neighbor, that is the youth, so long as it would fatten his own portfolio. As the foreigner caution widens to include not only women but now men in poem 5, it's as if the grandfather were saying that while women who are outsiders may seduce sexually, men who are outsiders may seduce economically. As an example of attitudes toward outsiders in the ancient Near East, the Greek historian Herodotus reports the following concerning Persians in the 5th century BCE. He writes, "After their own nation, they hold their nearest neighbors in most honor, then the nearest but one, and so on, their respect decreasing as the distance grows, and the most remote being the most despised. Themselves they consider in every way superior to everyone else in the world, and allow other nations a share of good qualities, decreasing according to distance, the furthest off being in their view the worst." As to co-signing for a stranger, the sage issues that similar caution in Proverbs 11:15. Pledging to guarantee debts is uniformly discouraged in Proverbs 22, 26, and 7, regardless the background of the borrower, and is reinforced by the unpleasant possibility of having your very bed pulled out from under you should you be short of cash when the borrower may default. So we see this crisis of guaranteeing a loan cropping up at various points within the book of Proverbs. Next, some comments from verses 3 through 8. The imperative "do this" in verse 3a presses on the youth that he must take an action of some undisclosed sort. As it turns out, this particular youth has a sufficiently severe case of the slows that this is not the sole call to action that he will require. He also requires a challenge to cease sleeping, that's verse 4. B, he requires imagery to help him visualize his need for alacrity, that's the snares and animals in verse 5. And C, he needs an entirely appended lesson dedicated wholly to stir up his self-motivation, that is verses 6 through 8. Regarding aversion to financial debt in the value system of the Persians, the Greek historian Herodotus writes this: "They consider telling of lies more disgraceful than anything else, and next to that, owing money. There are many reasons for their horror of debt, but the chief is their conviction that a man who owes money is bound also to tell lies." The sage here is concerned not with debt proper, but liability for another's potential default of debt. In verse 3, the grandfather exclaims, "Go!" Merely to recognize the predicament will not suffice. The youth also must convert awareness into execution. A wisdom writer of the 1st century CE makes the same point. Notice what James says in his letter, chapter 4, verse 16. Even in our current era, a book regarding effective leadership goes so far as to isolate the failure to convert strategy into reality That can be the Achilles tendon of present-day businesses. The grandfather is under no illusions concerning the binding nature of a business agreement. The youth must prostrate himself, verse 3c. The urgency sounding his advice suggests that the agreement was so recently concluded that the son may still be within an informal window of annulment, a period during which the borrower may be willing to cancel the co-signing agreement by returning the principal to the lender. He may be willing to do so provided the son acts before the borrower, that is the foreigner, has had opportunity to spend or make off with those funds. The tone changes considerably in verse 6, scaling down from the near frantic urgency of verses 1 through 5. Both that field trip, going to observe and learn from unsupervised insects, and the pace of life practiced by the ant inject a tone of steadiness and forethought, not the emergency evacuation tone of verses 1 through 5. Not only tone, but also topic turns, changing from the crisis need to escape financial collapse, now taking up the routine need for self-motivation. Routine practice of rhythmic motivation would, generally speaking, reduce the need for crisis motivation. In this way, the sage has converted the occasion of a financial emergency into an opportunity to address not only a surface need, the crisis motivation, but also a greater underlying need, the need for rhythmic motivation. Thus, moving from surface issue to root cause resembles how the grandfather handles the surface contract and the underlying capture, the surface neighbor and the underlying foreigner. Consistently, the wise perceive what the naive cannot. The last comments before moving to reflect on the lasting message of this poem will arise from verses 6 through 11. Notice the term vagabond. With this term, the specter of a sinister traveler once again returns, stitching the end of poem 5 with an inclusio reaching back to another journeyer in verse 1. That journeyer was the foreigner. Yet something has changed. The drifter of verse 11 is not the same person as the crafty contract entangler of verse 1. Rather, this vagabond is the youth's own poverty. It has become personified in verse 11. While deficiency of a financial sort fitly may represent the sage's primary concern for the youth, we would seriously underestimate the sage were we to suppose that material scarcity was the only poverty he foresaw awaiting his motivationally challenged son. So it is with smooth but sad closure that the reader makes this discovery. Just as the youth's original snare was self-inflicted, recall the observation in verse 2, "You have been caught by the sayings of your mouth," so also his looming peril will be self-inflicted. Personified poverty will overtake him. Not a difficult task, since this youth has proved so lazy, feeble, that he cannot overpower even his own bed covers. Since the foreigner of verse 1 has now faded from view, not to be mentioned again until poem number 8, the grandfather implies that when doom descends, no crafty stranger will share the credit for snaring the youth. The cocky youth will prove his consummate competence by this remarkable feat. He will manage to mug himself single-handedly. The father sage in chapter 1 of Proverbs develops with devastating concision the principle of folly's self-inflicted disaster. You may want to review Proverbs 1:17 through 19. Perhaps that father sage learned that principle from this poem of his own father, whom we call the grandfather sage. Finally, a comment is in order regarding the unique light that this poem number 5 sheds on the compositional process of Proverbs. For we find here the sage deploying a saying whose origin we learn of much later in the book. The grandfather seals poem 5 by quoting, "A little sleep, a little slumber, your shortfall will come like an armed man." We have the story of this saying's origin preserved in Proverbs 24, verses 30 through 34. You may want to read that. Proverbs 24, 30 to 34. In fact, the saying found here, the last two verses of the current poem, chapter 6, 10 and 11, this saying matches the saying in Proverbs 24, particularly verses 33 and 34, matches it nearly verbatim. So again, it sheds some light on the compositional process at work within Proverbs. We'll close our study of this fifth poem, Proverbs 6, 1 through 11, with 7 principles that arise from this teaching. Some of these principles lie on the surface of the poem, issuing straightforward warnings concerning human character and financial contracts, quite frankly. Other teachings emerge from repeated implications or from attitudes modeled by the grandfather. The first involves the importance of perception, a principle that builds on the same teaching found earlier in poem number 4. So consider the importance first of perception. In that preceding poem, poem 4, the grandfather marshaled various cautions concerning the enslaving tactics of a foreign woman, and, not incidentally, the positive encouragement to delight in one's own wife. That was located in Proverbs chapter 5. The foreign woman's sweet lips mask bitterness. Her smooth mouth conceals an equally smooth but double-edged sharp blade. Proverbs 5, 3 and 4. In short, that poem warned against veneers. Today delight, but tomorrow demise and death. If only the naive could see beyond the outer veneer, if only he could perceive the underlying peril. How foolish to embrace the foreigner, one you do not deeply know, one to whom you should not entrust yourself. Hopefully, the youth will take these cautions to heart, for any who thrust aside such caution, any who disregard such reprimand, will be consigned to a certain tottering towards death. Again, that says we're drawing from chapter 5, verse 23. And in this way, that poem, which we have numbered 4, that poem ended. The principle then that outer veneer masks actual peril characterizes the grandfather's concern here in poem 5 as well. It is evident in 4 areas. First, what appears to be a simple business deal may in fact mask a contract trap calculated to ruin the youth. Second, a business partner appearing to be a neighbor turns out to be a foreign con artist. Third, what appears to be annoying misjudgment, a minor contract wrinkle that may be ironed out after a bit more napping, turns out to be a deadly trap already sprung, as if it were a raging forest fire nearly encircling the soporific victim. And fourth, what appears to be a short-range crisis of complacency turns out to be a deeply entrenched habit of procrastination, a pattern of behavior which soon will overtake the dallying fool, with his own sleepily clasped hands robbing him of anything worthwhile. Thus, a recurring message of poem number 5 urges the youth to develop an awareness of underlying conditions and underlying character, and so to cultivate receptivity towards reprimand that's derived from one whose own perception exceeds that of the youth. This then is the principle regarding the importance of perception. Second, a principle involving financial contracts. A second principle then of poem 5 involves the trap of misleading financial contracts. Hidden risks will bring unnecessary ruin. This peril precipitated the entire reprimand comprising this poem. A third principle involves complacency. This observes that indulgence in excessive rest and ease fuels inertia and paralyzes self-motivation. No amount of good counsel will suffice until mixed with execution. Inaction atrophies the will until the enfeebled fool discovers himself pinned in bed indefinitely, trapped beneath the mere weight of his own bed covers. Had he as many brains as a bug, he would become self-sustaining. Fourth, a lesson about candor stemming from compassion. This fourth principle emerges as we observe the grandfather's tone. He does not shrink from confronting the youth, stating plainly his peril and recommending solutions. He cares for his son too deeply to allow any fear of rejection to deter intervention. And unfortunately, according to the way that this lesson flows, eventually his advice will be rejected. A fifth principle underscores the importance of repeatedly sounding an alarm. Because the youth is not yet convinced, the grandfather does not weary of reinforcing the fact of present peril. And so we learn there are times when a single sounding of the alarm will not suffice. A sixth principle models a rhetorical technique, closing with a challenge. Upon seeing no change in the youth despite repeated warnings, the grandfather presses the point. How long, lazy fellow, are you going to lie there? Chapter 6, verse 9. The last of these 7 principles emerges from the grandfather's response to that final rejection. In the end, the youth discards the reprimand as superfluous. Chapter 6, verse 10. The grandfather could have stopped right there, but to do so would be to miss a final opportunity. So he issues the last word, a word predicting self-inflicted doom. Verse 11. Perhaps this final forecast will lodge like a spark in tinder, igniting a light to guide the youth out of disaster. Interestingly, the sage son employs a similar rhetorical strategy, that is, forecasting immense hazard. When Lady Wisdom, back in chapter 1, responds to disinterested fools by indicating that when catastrophic disaster eventually descends, she will not bother to respond to their pleas for help. Chapter 1, verse 28. Since the theme of reprimand found here in this poem looms very large across Proverbs 4 through 9, it should not surprise us that the most concise example of reprimand should prove so refined in craftsmanship and so compact with this many teachings. Others of the grandfather's poems may in fact be longer, but few rival the mixture of heightened urgency and thematic complexity found here in poem number 5, that I've entitled, You Snared Yourself, Escape. In the poem that follows, that is, poem 6, chapter 6, verses 12 to 15, the grandfather will express dismay over the behavior of one whom he calls a worthless person, an individual that may actually represent the tragic extension of a character that began as a seemingly harmless case of complacency, that is, his own son, here in poem number 5. This concludes our study of Proverbs chapter 6, verses 1 through 11.